Good evening, everybody. Not evening. It's not even lunchtime yet. Good morning, everybody. Um, Happy Ascend Sunday. I hate that we're not getting to share the same space again. This is totally weather related, though, not COVID. So this is the normal for winter up here. Um, I have to try to in a little while to get to Limestone. I'm trying to time it so that all that bad weather is the wind and the blowing snow has died down by then. Um, but anyway, I've looked at the forecast, and we by the end of the week we're supposed to be getting up in the 40s, consistently. So I have a feeling we're going to start seeing some. We saw some thawing going on this last week. It just wasn't a lot, but I have a feeling this is about to really. It's about to really just start disappearing, even though we're still getting these little storms. So anyway, let me give you our text. Proverbs 23:23. A classic. A classic. Proverbs 23:23. Keep everyone in prayer. Keep Sister Elena, Sister Teresa's families in prayer. Leroy and Shauna, as well as Paula and Donnie and Jesse. Wade and Jen. Evidently, Jen must have come through the COVID stuff okay, I guess, because Sister Teresa, last time we talked about it, hadn't really been hearing any updates, so that's good. All of my family downstate. Tony's still recovering from the effects of COVID. He doesn't have it anymore. Sister Scott's family seems to have gotten over their flu that they had go through the house there. And both of the great aunts that we prayed for last week, they're back home. And well, actually, I don't know they're back home, but they're only men for sure. I know one of them was for sure going into rehab, so maybe she's not home yet. But anyway, things seem to be falling into some sort of normalcy. So that's good. So just keep praying about, everyone dealing with COVID and the remnants of that left over. And of course, pray for our country and the world. We've got a war going on over in Eastern Europe. So just pray about that. Yeah, that's about it. So let's go to our text. Proverbs 23:23. Buy the truth and sell it not. Also wisdom and instruction and understanding. I am so glad that the writer added those things to that. So the truth is in itself isn't a monolithic, standalone, static thing. It's something that is vast. It is something that is bigger than just our little brains, and that means it requires study, it requires instruction, it requires understanding, it requires some wisdom and some patience and some humility and all the things that go with wisdom. And so I love that verse. It shows that the truth isn't some discrete set or tiny list, or even a fairly medium-sized list of things we just accept as true, and then we're done knowing truth. We don't have to think about it anymore. Don't have to work about it, and we don't just have to make sure we keep that. No, it's about it's about learning, right? It's about learning because we only can hold so much in one brain. So today's title is Truth-Seeking Methods. Truth-Seeking Methods. Lord, we love you today. We ask you to take care of our families and our friends, all those who are fighting sickness. God, we're thankful that we seem to be coming slowly but surely out of the pandemic stage and transitioning to the endemic stage. And things seem to be on the right trend there. It's been a long road, Lord, and we appreciate that. God, we ask you to put your hand on the situation overseas, and that somehow that gets resolved without any more bloodshed, God. And no more destabilization. We've had enough bad news for several years. It's time, God, for some good news, please. God, we also ask you to touch those family members who have struggles of other kinds, Lord, from family issues to other health-related concerns, and just help them all get stronger and better and continue to improve. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so truth-seeking methods. Buy the truth. That's a metaphor, right? We're going to mention metaphors again, or analogies specifically. It's an analogy. It tells us that truth is like a commodity. It's like almost as if you can go to a marketplace and find it. So how high is the price tag? What kind of currency do you use to purchase it? Where exactly do you shop for truth? Is it only found in one spot, or is it all around us? Some places seem to be very active in trying to sell us what they call truth. They have all the slick answers and all the fast lines and all the shiny suits and the neon signs. And are these reliable places? Is the truth that they're selling? Do they have quality wares in those shops? See, there's all kinds of interesting, fun questions we can ask when we start using analogies like that, right? And each one of them might shed some light on the topic. Now, I think we can push it too far, right? We can take the analogy and suddenly the analogy becomes synonymous in our mind with the actual thing. Buying things in a marketplace and truth it can become almost as if in our minds they're exactly the same thing. And we know that that's not the case. For instance, you don't go around shopping and marketplaces to purchase, bottles of truth on a shelf, right? And if we push that analogy too far, it starts falling apart, and it can even lead to some weird ideas about how truth is truth. Did it cost you anything? Did you actually pay for it? And did you shop for it? Is it something that's so marketable that you can conveniently find it the way you can other marketable goods? And it just gets really weird and hairy and doesn't exactly make sense if you push it too far. There's some truth in the notion, buy the truth, as if it's something you can market and be sold and bought. But if you push it too far, all of a sudden it ceases to be true and it becomes some weird idea. That's called a fallacy. That particular fallacy is called confusing the map for the place. An analogy, a map, for instance, a map is not actually the terrain you're going to drive on. When you look at a road map, that's not the real place, right? It's not exactly true. It's an approximation of the truth. It's an analogy. It's not the actual place. The map isn't. And sometimes people can confuse the map for the place. And they start looking, say, here's the map. This is totally true. Look at this analogy that I'm using. The analogy proves it. No, it's not perfect. Maps don't have terrain. Maps don't have tell you the traffic conditions. Maps can even have the lines drawn totally wrong, and the road's actually longer than it shows. And that's one type of fallacy that can make knowing the truth tricky. So we're going to get more into logical fallacies in a minute. I'm going to list a few of them, and confusing the map for the place is one of those. There are ways to know truth, but there are a lot of ways that people use to supposedly know truth that aren't designed or set up or built to detect and know truth. They're actually designed to do other things, but they feel good to us. And so we latch onto those as if the results they produce are in fact truth. I mentioned some of this last week, where sometimes we fall prey to buying into a notion because our family believes the notion and our friends believe the notion, our group that we are, where we feel our community, where we feel at home, buys into the notion. And sometimes we mistake it feeling right, that feeling of being accepted in the group, being liked by the group, being loved by others. We accept that good feeling as confirmation that we have whatever that truth is, that it's actually true. Those aren't the same thing. Arriving at a true conclusion may in fact put you at odds with your community, may in fact make your family disagree with you. Your family could not like what you found out when you investigated. So in fact, sometimes the truth doesn't feel good, right? But we can people tend to confuse that thing which makes us feel like all is right in the world. Well, that must be the truth. That's not a truth seeking method. That's a truth assuming method. Yeah. You can't get at the truth by assuming things, but we commonly do exactly that. Now, here, one of the methods, another method that I like to think about, problematic ways of arriving at truth, is something where we don't actually have a method. It's not a method. It's just something that happens to us, and I call this this truth assuming method. I call this acculturation or truth by association. In other words, from the day that we're born, and sometimes maybe not then, sometimes just by becoming a part of the community, there are assumptions that are layered into the speech that are assumed to be right and true without, to the point that people don't even talk about it anymore. They just operate on the basis of these things as if they're true. They're considered normal. They're considered common sense. They're considered common knowledge. They're thought of as being self-evident. One of these notions that people throughout history used to believe, and we still got some conspiracy theorists out there that are trying to repopularize this notion, and that's the notion that the Earth is flat. That used to be common sense. You look around, you drive down the road, that road's not going like this unless there's a hill, then it levels back out. Generally speaking, especially go to the Great Plains, there was no hills at all. Look, see, what are you talking about? The Earth being round, right? And so we just grow up walking and talking in this reality, and it just feels like it's normal. It just feels like it's obvious, and everybody else seems to buy into it, and we don't even think about it anymore. So it's not a truth-seeking method. It's a truth-assuming method. We begin to operate on that and build structures of belief and knowledge and logic on that assumption. And all of that may seem like it jives and makes sense. And yet the whole time there's this assumption at the foundation we haven't even thought to question. We haven't even thought about whether it might be true. And if we did, suddenly our whole structure, this castle we built in the sand, would come crumbling down. So now we've got all this emotional weight and all of this vested historical effort put into all the structures that are built on this foundation of sand. And now we're really resistant to considering whether or not this thing down at the bottom, whether or not that's true, because that means our whole lives have to change and our whole assumptions have changed. Our relationships will be endangered by it. But once again, at no point did we ever seek the truth of that foundation. We may have sought ways to reaffirm it once someone started questioning it. That's not the same as trying to find out whether something's true. That is trying to prove that it's true after assuming it already is. That is not the same. That's more focused on being right within a conversation and a disagreement than it is to understanding the truth of something and what it's based on and how we can know it. Very different things. One is a naturally inherent arrogant position. I already know. I don't need to think about it. I don't think it's purposely arrogant. It is, we don't think we're being haughty and unreasonable, but we're not thinking about it at all, right? We just want to build our structure on there and protect that whole structure, so we don't even talk about that thing at the bottom. So that's a truth assuming method. We have these common things. I remember a conversation with my father when I was a kid. It was common knowledge in my area of Louisiana, among my family and friends, that if you wanted to make ice in the freezer, it's better to fill your ice tray up with hot water than cold. I know, let that soak in. I mean, now looking back, and hopefully from where you're sitting, that's just crazy, right? But it was common knowledge. Everybody knew. Yeah. It's an interesting phenomenon. Don't know how, don't know why. And they just assumed to be true. Hot water freezes faster than cold water. And it came up in my physics class at high school, and I had never thought much about it, but suddenly my teacher was questioning it, and I got thinking, how would that work? What is that based on? And so I asked my dad about it. He says, "Oh no, it's based on the act of falling. When you start at a higher place and you start falling, the farther you fall, the faster it gets." And at first that sounded like it made sense. Yeah, higher temperature, falling from further. Wait a minute. But the more I thought about it, wait a minute, falling temperature is not actually gravity acting on an object and pulling it down. We call it falling because we have in our mind these old school thermometers, and we've used these numbers that suggest low, that we think of lower and higher. But that's the map, and now we're confusing it with a place. See, there's that fallacy again. Now that particular assumption that was built into my group, my culture, and the way we thought wasn't that upsetting, and yet there was real resistance to it. Why was there real resistance to people considering the fact that maybe cold water could freeze faster because it's already closer to the freezing point? Why was that resistant? Because all of a sudden there's all these years of family tradition and ritual and practice and conversations, and all of this stuff becomes questionable because this small thing was a part of all that. And to call that into question means, oh, wait a minute, I need to be questioning other stuff too, right? And so even though it was a small thing, there was resistance against it. Another conversation was there was a young couple in the church there, and there was just a handful of young people. It was like me and my brother and a couple of other guys, like maybe just one other guy this time. We were the only young people in the whole church, and we didn't have a real youth group. And this young man, he was the nephew and the grandson of the pastor and assistant pastor. So, whole family thing going on there. Well, they moved to our little town, be close to family, part of that church. And he was a young couple. He and his wife, they had 2 girls. And so they decided they would kind of do stuff with us young guys, just so we had some sort of youth activities. They felt burden for us, because we live in a small town, bored out of our minds. We were over their house one time eating dinner, and this conversation comes up about how, they were really hoping that their next child was a boy. And me, being young and not really understanding the ropes, I was like, why? And he was like, well, because right now there's only one other person in my generation to carry on the family name, and that's the assistant pastor's little young son. He was I think 5 or probably 7 or 8 at the time. So their kid who wasn't there. And I was like, okay. And I was like, why does it matter that a family name hangs around? What does that do? How does that work? And so I brought this home and I broached it at dinner with my family. I was like, yeah, he was saying this. And I was like, I never understood that. Why does it matter whether it's a boy or a girl child? And why does it matter if the family name goes on? And my dad was like, he was flabbergasted that I was questioning that. I had never expected my dad to have such a reaction. He was like, well, because you got to carry on the family name. I was like, why? And they're just as, if it's your daughter, she's just as related to you as your son, just as much your child. Don't you love them just as much? Yeah, but that's not what I'm saying. You got to carry on the family name. And he just kept saying that. He never explained why it mattered. He never explained what happened if you didn't, and what the negative repercussions were. He never dug into that. Why? What had happened is I had struck a blow against one of those assumed truths. No method got there. And when you question it, it became immediately apparent that there was no real method or reason to it anymore. It was based on very historic practices where history had assumed men were somehow more viable, and they're the ones who the family was named after, and they're also the ones who inheritance and lineage was based on. But none of that, those old practices really weren't relevant anymore in modern American society. Each child, regardless of sex, got an equal inheritance. And even though sometimes sons are still showed favor even today, right? But that doesn't mean it's right. So when I asked it, all my dad could do was just keep repeating it. He couldn't explain why. Why was that? Because there was no methodology, no conscious methodology by which he got to that. He just absorbed that from his upbringing, from what others did and said, and he was operating on that and viewing the world and the way families were worked, and whether or not, a family had girl children or boy children, and how much, and that mattered somehow. But never had he asked that question of the foundational notion that passing on a family name matters. It only matters, as far as I can tell, when it relates to the pride of the men in the family, right? So a truth assuming method, it's not really a method at all, is it? It's just a fact that people do it. It's just the way our brains work, or maybe don't work that well. Now, so let me give you an actual method, a truth seeking method. This is a way to actually buy the truth. I want to point that out, by the way. That truth assuming method, it doesn't cost you anything to buy that truth, does it? You just wind up with it because you lived around people saying it all the time and assuming it all the time, and you just soaked it in. You didn't pay nothing for that. You may pay for the negative consequences of trying to hold on to a silly notion that ain't true, but you didn't pay for it. According to our scripture, the truth is something you buy. You got to earn some money and some sort of means of exchange, and do some work and invest to get it. So here's a method by which you can buy the truth, this thing that you have to learn and use instruction and understanding and apply wisdom to get. However, this first process, this is what people who have started thinking about how do I know what's true is true, this is what they start doing, and they're becoming conscious of it, but it's not the best method yet. But at least they're starting to have a method. First of all, gather what you know about something. How do I know this thing is true? What do I know about it? Ask that question. I know this, I know this, I know this, and start making a list. See how that's an actual step? See how you're actually starting to build some sort of understanding of all the things attached to it and why it's that way? You're at least starting to really reflect and think about whether or not something's true, and how you know it's true, and what's related to it. Trying to really think about that foundation. Gather what you know. After you've gathered all you know, step back, look at it, and see what kind of thing, what it adds up to, what truth it seems to fit. Once you've got that, step 3, check whatever proper box goes with that collected image that you saw when you put it all together, and consider that you've got it now. Consider it settled. Now, all of that sounds good. It definitely is better than the old truth assuming stuff that we tend to do, right? At least there's a method there. At least I'm trying to work at being honest and accurate. By the way, don't call yourself honest if you don't care about accuracy. That's not very accurate. Okay. Here's some problems with this method. Step 1 was gather what we know. Okay, good. I think that's a good step. But is it enough? First of all, what we know could include some of those assumptions that we were talking about. For instance, if I had asked my dad to do that step in relation to why it's important for a family name to exist, he could have listed, it's important that the family name be carried on. He could have just said that and just moved on from there, as if that was, we all know that, right? It's self-evident. That's common sense. That's common knowledge. He could have listed it. So maybe what we think we know, when we start gathering what we know, has some of those assumptions listed in there. Things that we aren't aware are just assumptions. Things we don't dare think about whether or not they're justified or not. It could be some of those things we absorbed from everyone around us, something that is common sense or common knowledge. Maybe we were born into a group of people who believe it. So that's one problem with gathering what we know. Another problem with just gathering what we know is what we know may be inaccurate. It could be even entirely false. There is some bias built into that sentence, gather what we know. We may not know it. We may just believe it. But there's some bias built in there. So we gather what we know. Well, here's this fact, here's this fact, here's a fact. Well, maybe they're not all facts. But here's this fact. Oh, there we got our answer. We walk off, we go on, and we never considered whether A, we had assumptions listed there too, B, whether we had facts that were the exact opposite of what they actually were. Like, A, no, hot water doesn't freeze faster than cold water. That's just a fact. That's a scientific fact. No, it's not. It's not a scientific anything. It's some urban legend, some common folklorish myth thing that people said, and for whatever reason in North Louisiana. So, A, the problem with gathering what we know is what we think we know may be some of those assumptions. B, some of the things we think are facts may just in fact be entirely incorrect or wrong or partially wrong. And then finally, C, we probably don't know everything. Imagine that. Gather what we know. Fine. What you know and what I know is probably a tiny, 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 infinitesimal subcategory of what it actually is. The universe is big, friends. So gather what you know about something. Thing is, you probably don't have all the facts and all the perspectives. So that's step one. So there's 3 problems with step one. Step two was step back and see what it adds up to. Well, there's some problems here too. Our brain assumes that it knows enough to interpret and make that summative assessment. In other words, step back and see what it adds up to assumes you know the various things it can add up to. You ever taken a multiple choice test and in the questions, they have choices A, B, C, and D, and you select one and come to find out not all the answers were included in the list? That's the way we're all living. We have a set number of possible answers / patterns in our head that we're always trying to see which all the things add up to which of those. Meanwhile, there may be whole categories of things, possible answers that aren't in our head. We may not have all the answers on the multiple choice question, but we act as if we don't know that. All we know are A, B, C, and D. There's E, F, G, H, J, K, L, M, N, O, P. There's all kinds of possible answers maybe to that thing. But we only consider the ones that we see and that we already have in the queue and think that represents the whole. What if our brains only have 4 possible labels to the question, but there's a 5th, a 6th, or a 100th? And what if those other answers are so foreign, so unfamiliar, so alien to anything that we have grown up to consider a normal reality, that not only are we not aware of those answers, that we can't even imagine them? Think about that. Is that too far-fetched? Let's face it. There was a time in human history when the notion of the earth being a sphere would have fit that description. That whole idea that we're standing on a ball and not falling off, that is just so alien and mind-blowing that no human had ever even imagined it before a certain point in history. It's not that it just wasn't on the test, it was just beyond the scope of human imagination. And boy, are we so arrogant as to think that there's nothing like that now too, that suddenly somehow we've got there's only a fraction, a tiny thing left for us to figure out. But unlike all those people in the past, we've got all the answers now. Really? Boy. Something else that's a problem with seeing what it adds up to, and the fact that our brains may assume that it knows enough to interpret when it may not. When we look at what it adds up to, we are literally looking at how it does fit our notion of the patterns that we've already become familiar with in our head. That's all we have to choose from. We can only draw from that which we already have experience with. And if the answer is something we have no experience with, our brain doesn't tell us that typically. Our brain just say, "Oh, I don't know what that is. I don't know what to say about that. That all adds up to something." No, that is not what our brain does. If we're not consciously trying to keep ourselves from making assumptions, our brain makes assumptions automatically. And it makes assumptions that fit from what it already has, as a possible answer to the multiple choice question. It says, oh, I can see in that collection of things an elephant. It's an elephant. Meanwhile, it's not an elephant because it had wool and it had a giant hump and the tusks were a giant shape and it lived in North America and it was a mammoth. Right? So when we see what it adds up to, we're automatically, without even knowing it, assuming that the set answers, the patterns we're familiar with in our head it's going to somehow fit one of those. An entire new thing would just look like gibberish to us, and has often been the case in history. If we were able to see all of the things, because we're likely to pick out a familiar pattern before our brains even get to consider the fact that some of those facts don't fit. Because that's the second thing. Not only does our brain automatically make assumptions and pull from patterns already in our head, it actually actively filters out all the facts that don't fit automatically. I told you this story about the playing card demonstration that I witnessed and saw just how limited my brain was, where they would flash the image of a deck of 52 cards. They would draw cards at random, flash them in front of the camera for a fraction of a second at a time. And I could identify all the cards except 2 or 3. For some reason, the 2 or 3 were evading me and my brain couldn't see it. I could not identify it. It slowed it down and did it longer, and still my brain couldn't identify those cards. And the reason my brain couldn't identify those cards is because I only had 52 possibilities in my head. And those 2 of the cards, they were possibilities 53 and 54, not typically in a deck. My brain was operating off the assumption without even consciously thinking about it. It did it automatically and was trying to find. I knew it was in my mind. I was seeing a heart. I was seeing a spade. I was seeing black and red. And so in my head, I was operating the assumption it's going to fit one of those patterns. It is one of those patterns. And what was actually in front of my face, my brain wouldn't tell me. It wouldn't give me the information, even though I was looking at it. And when I finally got time to slow down and work past my brain's tendency to make it fit one of those 52 possibilities, I realized, oh, it's a black 2 of hearts. What's a black 2 of hearts? It's something brand new that I had never encountered before. And only until I took time to make my brain not go through its natural assumption, familiar pattern picking process, that I was even able to comprehend what I was looking at. It was a 2-dimensional card about this big. Imagine the bigger, more complex truths, how much your brain is just shutting out what information is there and going with what it already thinks it knows. Here's another problem with what adding up what the collected information looks like. Our brain may be susceptible to and frequently use bad reasoning. In other words, we think we're seeing what the facts add up to, but we don't even know how to add. Think about that. I mentioned earlier a fallacy, confusing the map for the place, where you start taking this analogy and instead of realizing analogies, they're good for a little bit, but they're not exactly true and perfect in every way and don't exactly match reality. That's why it's called an analogy. It's not the thing. It's something that kind of helps us see the real thing from a different angle, but it's not the actual thing. People can start operating as if that's the entire truth and forget there's more out there that doesn't fit. Yeah, that's one fallacy. Another one's called the sharpshooter fallacy. I'm going to throw out just a few fallacies real quick that people do all the time. Because, by the way, when you commit some of these fallacies, these are jumps or leaps in logic. In other words, they don't actually make sense. We're not going to the effort of actually connecting dots. We're jumping past a bunch of dots to get where we want to go. We're not working hard to earn the currency to buy the truth. The sharpshooter fallacy. It's where you create some explanation, acting as if you know, and after you've done that, you then go draw a circle around what you said and see, I was right. It's called a sharpshooter fallacy because the analogy is you have a blank target, has nothing on it, just a big white space at the end of the shooting range. The marksman shoots it, then draws his circle around and say, look, I hit the bullseye. People do that. They'll reason something, and then they'll draw a circle around, even though they started off talking about something else, They'll start talking and reasoning, and finally their explanation isn't quite adding up to the thing that they were ostensibly going to prove. So they go and draw a circle around something that sounds similar, but it's actually a new thing because they don't have a good case for the original point. But then acting as if they prove their argument and they still have that same case. Post hoc rationalization. Post hoc rationalization. That's where you see something that's happened, and then you come up with supports and reasons for that thing fitting what you already thought. But you have to create and piece things together after the fact. It's retroactively trying to make reality fit your assumptions rather than allowing it to say whatever it says. You've created reasoning after the fact. Counting the hits and ignoring the misses. You'll notice there's some similar things here. Let me give you an example of counting the hits and ignoring the misses. When people go to spiritualists, people who read tarot cards, palms, things like that, or when they go see, mediums, there are some common practices and ways that these people talk and deal with things. Astrology does the same thing. Number one, they talk in very vague, ambiguous things that feel very specific, but they're the kind of things we already kind of believe or want to believe about ourselves. Like you are very outspoken. People really like you. Things like that sound. The things we want to believe about ourselves, and we tend to, even if they're not true. And so they'll say a lot of things like that. And then as the audience member or the person, the paying client who's getting their palms read, or maybe not paid, could be someone just participating, seems like, yeah. Then they use that to start zeroing in, and they start getting a little bit more specific. And people who go to these types of mediums and spiritualists will tell you things like, yeah, they told me one day that I was going to learn some bad news at work. And I did. And that just tells you right there, it's real. There's really spirits that are talking to us through those cards, right? And then you can ask them, so what else did they say in the session? What? I don't know. I mean, that's what they helped me. That's where I needed help. And this thing happened at work. I'm not asking about the hit. I'm asking about all the other stuff they said that you're not even mentioning now. I don't remember everything else they said. That's the thing that sticks out to me because it's true. So the one thing that seemed to hit, you remember that. But all these other things they said that just seemed to be kind of spurious and not exactly touching on anything, you're forgetting those. You're counting the hit, but ignoring the misses. And people don't just do it with spirituals, they do it with all kinds of stuff. Confusing the purpose with the cause. When someone asks you, why did this happen? Sometimes we will answer things like, because I really enjoy this particular thing. Why did you eat all the pizza? I don't know if I like that one. I think of another one. Why is there no pizza? Sometimes when we say, why is there no pizza left the next day, the person who ate all the pizza will say, well, because we didn't buy enough pizza. Meanwhile, the real reason is a cause, because I wanted the pizza, or as a purpose, because I wanted the pizza, I acted on it, I ate it. Sometimes we will answer with why something is the case. For instance, why do you believe? Here's an example. How do you know, or why do you know that tarot cards are true? Because they make me, they help me cope with my day-to-day life. Wait a minute. That sounds like a reason why you want them to be true, but that doesn't sound like a method by which you measured whether or not they're true. See, how do we know, or why do we know they're true would be because I did a test. They made these very specific predictions. They made 50 predictions, very specific, we can measure, and 45 out of 50 times it was exactly right. That means I'm about 90% sure that these things are true. That's a causal link. I know this is true because I measured it. But we will say, I know it's true because it makes me feel good in my life. No, that's not a cause. That's what you want to get out of it. That's the purpose why you do it. So confusing the purpose for the cause. Here's another one. mistaking the map for the place. I mentioned that one. Composition fallacy. Composition fallacy is when we assume that one part of a thing and it's the characteristics, the consistency, the nature of this one part, we assume that applies to the whole. It's called a composition fallacy. Sometimes individual parts have certain characteristics that the whole thing that they're part of don't. When you put a whole bunch of different things together, the whole can have different characteristics based on the way those things interact than the individual parts do. Argument ad populum. This is when we assume something to be true because everybody we know believes it. A lot of people believe this. How can so many people be wrong? Lots of different ways so many people can be wrong and often have in history. So that doesn't prove a thing. Argument from incredulity. Oh, this is one people use a lot. Well, I can't think of any other answer, so it must be this. Just because you can't imagine another answer, you're going to go with one of the ones you already had? You know all the possible answers in the universe already? How big is your brain? You not being able to come up with another answer just means your imagination has failed, not that the actual answer you've decided to go with is the right one. What else could it be? That's another question when they're doing argument. What else could it be? I don't know what else it could be, but it could be something that we hadn't thought of yet and considered, because since we're finite humans with little bitty brains and there's lots of the stuff we don't know yet. Argument from authority. Well, Dr. So-and-so said, argument from authority can, authorities in a particular field can matter and should have more credibility than people who don't have any authority in the field. So argument from authority isn't to say, I believe this particular thing about how COVID is impacting my body because this Dr. So-and-so said that this is what's happening. The question becomes, okay, maybe there's some credence because if this person is a doctor, what kind of doctor is it? Oh, I'm not sure. I think they're a podiatrist. So a foot doctor is telling you that this thing about how this disease spreads works, and because that person has doctor in front of their name, you're going to buy into it. Number one, even an epidemiologist can be wrong, but they have a lot more chance of being right than anybody else. So hanging your hat on, well, they could be wrong and saying, I'm going to buy into this podiatrist. Come on. Go with what they say until you have better information. Finally, another type of fallacy is appeal to force. Well, these people seem to be successful. These people are more powerful. These people have more money. These people have whatever. They're overwhelming the competition. They must be right. This is the kind of thing that Putin's depending on right now. Being the most forceful and being the winner is going to somehow prove that he was the one in the right. So after seeing that there are problems with, gathering what we know, after we see that there are problems with stepping back and seeing what it adds up to, checking off the right box could be a disastrously bad move. We may have gotten to that box with incomplete or bad information. That information in the boxes themselves may be based on assumptions we've absorbed and inherited. And these assumptions can be so foundational that we haven't even thought consciously about checking on them. Checking that box could be a problem because we may not have a box for what it is we're looking at. So because method one, even though it's better than just assuming stuff, it's still got some problems. I'm going to give you method two. First of all, we still have the first step. Gather what we know, but admit we don't know everything. In fact, step number two is, after we gather what we know, assume we don't know it all and may have it wrong. Assume we are attached and maybe even passionate about our position, which is to say, we're not exactly fair about how strong our position is because we love it a little bit too much. Assume that we're probably biased, unfairly predisposed to assume our position is stronger than it is. Assume that is the case. Assume you are doing that right now. Don't get offended about it. Don't get your hackles up and say, I'm not wrong. No, that impulse is exactly why you need to disregard your own credibility. That impulse, how dare you? No, if you feel defensive over someone saying you might be wrong, then you are not a good person to sort out truth, because already you can't even consider that you might be wrong. A person who wants to know whether or not they're right is going to start with the assumption not that they're right. They're going to gather what they know, and then they're going to question it. And they're going to assume, I'm probably missing something. I need to investigate. Don't work to prove you're right. Work to prove you are wrong. Think about that. Everybody tends to say, I'm going to prove I'm right here, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to put together this list of little things, and it's all going to add up to what I think is true. Yeah, anybody does that. Everybody does that. People who have totally different, opposite opinions do that exact same process. And yet they can't both be right. And they're both doing exactly that same thing. See, you go here, if you follow me here, you follow me here, and you put this after that, and you put that after that, and you have this particular way that I'm stacking up these things in this particular order. It always adds up to me being right. Okay, fine. They're not stacking up those same things in that same order. And so they're always right. No. Don't work to prove you're right. Work to prove yourself wrong. If you fail to prove that you're wrong, hey, now your position, you can feel a little more strongly about it. Now you're more affirmed. That's dangerous to run with that all the time. Don't ever buy into that notion that, that I'm definitely right and never question it again, because you still have more to learn. There's still more information out there you don't have yet, because your brain hasn't soaked up the entire universe yet. But if you can't prove it wrong, then hey, I'm going to stick with this position. I have to stay with this right now. However, if on the other hand, if you work to prove your position wrong and you do, now suddenly you're open to finding a better position, a stronger position, a more secure position, a more accurate position. In philosophy and in science, this is called the falsifiability test. Is it falsifiable? Which is to say, how would I test this to know whether or not it's true? How would I figure out it was false if it is false? For instance, if I claim to have $10,000 in my wallet, I should be able to postulate a way to falsify, which is to say, test whether or not I actually do have $10,000 in my wallet. And that falsifiability test I would open my wallet and show you its contents, proving that in fact I don't have any money in my wallet at all. I have falsified the claim and demonstrated it to be true. I had a falsifiability method. So if you believe something, if you hold something to be true, if there's something you're buying into and you think it's true, okay, what's the falsifiability test? How would you check it? How would you measure it? How would you demonstrate it for an unbiased friend, an unbiased third party? How would you demonstrate it to them with that falsifiability test? It passes the falsifiability test, you're golden. If it fails it, hey. Claims that cannot be falsified. Here's the problem. Not all claims can be falsified. For some things, there's no way to test it at all. So does that mean, if I can't test it? Well, we're getting back into that, one of those fallacies, the argument from incredulity. Well, I can't think of another answer, so this one must be right. Claims that cannot be falsified aren't stronger claims. Claims that you can't test whether or not they're true, that doesn't make it better. That makes it weaker. Suddenly it's falling underneath the ludicrous umbrella of stuff people say and make up without any way of knowing. Let me give you an example. Underneath this particular idea of something not being falsifiable is this old what's the word I'm looking for here? I guess it'd be a type of analogy. It's called Russell's teapot. Russell was I think it was Bertrand Russell, again, with this was famous philosopher. If someone postulates to you, says to you, there is a teapot floating around Saturn among the rings of Saturn, and I know this is true, and you were to say, well, how can you know this is true? They wouldn't have an answer. They can say, well, I scanned all of the rings of Saturn with a telescope. So did the We have telescopes that are capable of picking up every little rock, every little piece of the billions of items that make up those rings. You've done a thorough search of it all, and you think with all that mess of rock and matter floating around Saturn that you could pick out one lone teapot? Well, I just know, how would you prove, if there is no teapot floating around Saturn, what method could you use to find out? In other words, you claim there's a teapot. How can you prove, how would you test it to know whether that's false or not? We don't have one. We have no way of checking. We don't have powerful enough instruments. We just can't. Saturn's too far away. There's too much debris around Saturn. Teapot's too small. There's no way to know. So the question becomes, why in the world are you believing there's a teapot there in the first place then? So, step one, gather what you know. Go ahead and do that. But before you start adding things up, assume that you have it wrong. Assume your position is biased. Work to find out what kind of falsifiability test you can run it through. And then not only assume you might have it wrong, assume you don't know enough yet, and look for more. Look for what people who are experts have found out about the subject. Those who have spent the most time studying the subject, not spouting opinions about it, not talking to other people with opinions about it, but the experts themselves. What do they say about it? How have they done the falsifiability testing? How have they done experimentation and observation? How have they measured? How have they investigated? What have they done to know it? Look to them. Listen to those people. Seek more information from them. Don't assume you know it all. Make additional observations of your own. Build some sort of framework to test it, to falsify it. Build some sort of framework of cataloging it that resists or pushes back against your tendency, because we all have it, to try to bend it and shape it to fit what we already think. After you've done all that work, then step back and see what it adds up to. Paying. Now, remember, there's still problems with that step too. So when you do step back, see what it adds up to, pay close attention to any information that doesn't really fit. What percentage of the information, of the facts, of the things you gathered don't fit that pattern? Because remember, not only do you have to see what it adds up to, you have to assume maybe you don't have all the answers on the multiple choice test there, that there are some categories you don't know of yet. This is a way to help you try to take that into consideration. It's not easy and it doesn't always work. But pay close attention to how much of the information doesn't seem to fit. Because remember, your brain's going to automatically filter that out in favor of one of the patterns already in your head. Don't let it do that. Purposely refocus your gaze away from this convenient spot that seems to be confirming what you already thought you knew. Look away from that. Look to all the other information that doesn't quite fit. Say, okay, how does this fit? What does this say? What is it saying? Don't try to force it. What percentage of the information doesn't really naturally fit without you trying to contort it and work it and make it fit? If it's one fact out of 100 that just seems to be an outlier, hey, yeah, you can feel pretty strong that maybe you've got it right. I'm not going to say you should just dismiss that fact. I'm saying that fact, but let's go investigate that. What's going on with that? Why is this one not fitting? That's an opportunity to learn something. If it's like 10% or 20% or 50% of the facts that aren't really fitting with this thing that you've settled on as the answer, then you better not assume you've got truth for sure. You bet there's only one answer you need to be given at that point. I don't know. I don't know is a phrase commonly used by honest truth seekers. I want you to think about that. Honest truth seekers are very open and very comfortable with saying, I don't know. So look at how much facts don't fit. Look at which facts don't fit. It could be that there's not a whole lot of facts that don't fit, but there's a one that doesn't fit that also happens to be very, very kind of important to the heart of what you're seeing. Could be the heart of your answer. This particular thing is a very important thing, and it's not jiving with your answer. could be enough grounds to decrease your confidence in the answer. By the way, though, if that's the case, that's not a problem. That's an opportunity. It's a clue to where you need to look and what else you need to research and find out about. The facts that don't fit are only problems if you are still biased and attached to your particular answer, which is to say, you're still being a bit arrogant. Notice how much work is involved in this process. If you're not still clinging to what you already have as truth in your bag, as if you're not just holding to what you already have, which means you didn't have to buy it, it wasn't a truth you had to go out and look for, then you can't see that facts that don't fit, they're not problems. They're exciting doors to a better understanding. After you've worked through all this process, remember the initial method after the assuming stuff. The initial method was gather what you know, step back and see what it adds up to, check the proper box, consider it settled. Well, now the method is gather what you know. Step 2, assume that you might have it wrong and that you don't have enough information yet. Step back after you've gone through the process of trying to gather more information, listen to experts, do all that falsification tests, see what that adds up to, while being careful to pay attention what facts don't fit, how many facts don't fit. And finally, after you've done all that, after you've really done all that work to really buy the truth, to make the money, to do the work of earning that truth, okay, now you can check a box, but you better check it in pencil and keep an eraser handy. Never, never take the arrogant position of considering it settled, because you, friend, are limited, and so am I. There is more I still need to learn and more you still need to learn. And if I ever think, well, I know and it's settled, I maybe think I'm talking just about the thing itself, that thing that I think is settled. But I am implicitly saying all that I know and all that I have gathered in my head is the final word on it. I know all I need to know. And that's an arrogant position to be in. I have all the answers the universe offers about it. I need nothing else. How ridiculous, right? I love you. Have a great day. Go out, ye humble truth seekers, and gather more information. Goodbye.